Asserting central space, 1e4 immediately contests key squares and prepares for rapid piece development, opening diagonals for bishops and the queen. Carving out a potential queenside space, this pawn structure prepares to contest central ambition with a firm defensive backbone. Carving out a significant central pawn presence, this drive immediately challenges black's queenside space. Instantly contesting the center with the pawn establishes dynamic central tension and opens lines for piece development. Opening the center dramatically alters the fight for space and tempo. Recapturing the pawn with this pawn solidifies the center, creating a symmetrical pawn structure and opening the c-file for potential counterplay. Instantly opening lines, white challenges black's pawn structure, aiming to seize the center and disrupt black's development. Developing this knight untangles the position, preparing for rapid kingside expansion and challenging central control. Developing the knight to c3 secures the d4 pawn and prepares to challenge the center. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop pieces creates a balanced, albeit somewhat passive, pawn structure. Developing the knight here allows for the eventual castling and reinforces control over the central squares, while preparing to contest the initiative. Safeguarding the king while preparing for castle is the immediate priority. This bishop development also subtly supports the central pawn structure, preventing undue white pressure. Unburdening the center creates dynamic possibilities, opening lines for both pieces and pawns. Recapturing the pawn with the knight re-establishes material equality and opens up the d-file for potential future action by black's rook, while simultaneously developing a piece towards the center. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, this move immediately eyes black's queenside pawn structure and prepares for castling, while also increasing pressure along the c-file that may become more relevant later. The knight sidesteps further aggression, finding a more secure square while preparing to bolster the center's defense and potentially launch a counterthrust down the d-file. Securing the monarch is paramount. Castling achieves this, simultaneously preparing to connect the rooks and bring them into the fray along the central files that have been so dynamically contested. Preemptively securing the b5 square, this move subtly prepares for a queenside expansion or a potential knight outpost, while also creating a safe haven for the bishop should it retreat. Anticipating black's queen-knight sortie to b4 or d4, placing the rook on the e-file prepares to contest control of this central thoroughfare and potentially support a future d5 pawn push or exchange sacrifice on e6. Carving out space on the queen side, black challenges white's central presence and prepares to activate their bishop. This pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's control and potentially open lines for counterplay, though it does commit the pawn and creates potential weaknesses if not supported. Discarding the central pawn tension, this exchange aims to simplify the position while potentially opening lines for white's rooks later on. But it also grants black a simplified pawn structure and eliminates a potential weakness white might have developed with the c-pawn. Capturing the pawn on d5 fundamentally reshapes the pawn structure, creating a passed pawn for white while opening lines that black must now actively defend. Unpinning the knight opens up an immediate tactical skirmish, seeking to disrupt black's pawn structure by exploiting the pinned piece. Exploiting the pin, this maneuver aims to gain a tempo and potentially create weaknesses in black's central pawns by forcing a reaction. Introducing a direct challenge to the knight, this move initiates a positional battle for central control and knight activity. By developing the bishop to this active square, white prepares to castle and also exerts pressure along the long diagonal. This bishop move creates an interesting tactical possibility, potentially leading to exchanges that could simplify the position or create new attacking avenues for white. Securing the monarch with a swift castling maneuver is a prudent reaction to the active piece play and central pawn tension, consolidating the king's position for the impending middle game struggles. Exchanging the bishop here simplifies the position, potentially leading to an endgame where white's slightly better pawn structure could become relevant, though black's queenside majority offers counterplay. This decision also relinquishes white's bishop pair, a key positional advantage in many closed or semi-closed Sicilian structures, which this position is trending towards. Consider the consequences of opening up lines for black's pieces, particularly their rooks on the open c-file should white not fortify it. A central knight finds a more stable square, immediately contesting white's dominant bishop and preparing to support the d-pawn's future advance. A calculated repositioning, the knight embarks on a journey to the queen side, potentially eyeing squares like c4 or b3 to exert pressure or reinforce the center, while also clearing the way for the c-pawn to advance. A bold repositioning, the rook embarks on a journey to the 7th rank, seeking active participation and potential control of the open file, while also offering a defensive shield to the king should any immediate threats materialize on the queen side. Initiating a knight repositioning to the queen side, this maneuver aims to establish a more robust outpost for the knight on a central square, potentially aiming for c5 or d4, thereby increasing pressure on black's pawn structure and potentially challenging the control of the c-file if it opens. The rook repositions, establishing a presence on the c-file, a critical avenue for potential pawn advances or piece infiltrations that might pressure white's queenside structure. Initiating a centralizing maneuver, the queen now assumes an active post, poised to support the knight's potential advance and contribute to controlling the d-file, while simultaneously eyeing the kingside for future operations. Stepping the rook onto the 6th rank, a bold territorial claim, potentially disrupting white's queenside ambitions while also preparing to eye the now somewhat exposed c2 square. White repositions the knight to a more flexible square, preparing to either contest the c-file or support a kingside advance, while simultaneously offering an escape route for the knight from any potential pressure along the open c-file. A bold repositioning, the knight ventures forward, contesting the center and eyeing the vulnerable d4 pawn, while simultaneously creating potential tactical skirmishes along the e-file and potentially opening avenues for its rook should the pawn structure shift. Challenging black's control of the c-file with this centralizing rook, white aims to disrupt the coordination of black's forces and potentially exploit weaknesses around the d5 pawn. The rook's sudden relocation to the 6th rank opens up intriguing possibilities for counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pieces and potentially threaten on the queen side. A bold thrust for central influence, directly challenging black's beleaguered king and probing for weaknesses on the king side. This energetic queen sortie immediately creates tactical ripples, aiming to exploit the open g-file and the slightly exposed position of black's monarch. It forces black to react, potentially disrupting their previously solid setup and creating opportunities for white to build an attack. The queen's presence on f4 exerts pressure not just on the king, but also indirectly on the knight on f5, which is now less well supported. White is seeking to generate immediate, tangible threats rather than settling for passive development. This move signals a shift in white's strategy, moving from positional maneuvering to a more aggressive, direct assault on black's royal defenses. It's a clear indication that white intends to seize the initiative. The knight's retreat to d6 reestablishes a defensive presence, though it relinquishes its forward outpost and creates a potential weakness on the now undefended e7 square. Unleashing a knight to the advanced outpost on c5 immediately creates significant pressure on black's queenside and central pawns, particularly the d5 pawn, forcing black to react defensively and potentially compromising the coordination of their pieces. A bold challenge to white's central control, this rook's advance seeks immediate counterplay on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and exploit any lingering weaknesses around the white king. The queen re-engages on the f3 square, subtly preparing for a potential regrouping while simultaneously eyeing the d5 pawn and creating indirect pressure. Re-establishing piece activity and asserting central influence, this maneuver repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to disrupt white's control and prepare for further offensive action. Rethinking the central structure, white repositions their rook, aiming to contest the open c-file and potentially support a future advance on the queen side or even central pawn push. Reclaiming the e-file and centralizing the rook, this maneuver aims to contest white's central pressure and potentially launch an offensive on the king side, subtly undermining white's piece coordination by creating a more active defense. Recapturing the pawn on g3 is a strategic retreat, aiming to dislodge black's knight from its aggressive outpost on f5 and potentially reroute the knight to a more defensively sound square. It also opens the g-file for future rook operations, a welcome development considering the cramped state of white's pieces. The knight's placement here, however, does grant black some breathing room and potentially allows them to consolidate their position or prepare a counterthrust. White is seeking to simplify and improve their piece coordination, acknowledging that the previous pawn push created a slight structural weakness. A timely exchange to simplify the position and alleviate the immediate pressure on the king side, though it allows white to establish a potentially strong outpost on d5. Reclaiming the open file with the rook immediately alleviates white's slight positional disadvantage, preparing to challenge black's defensive structure and potentially initiate central play. The knight now retreats, a prudent repositioning to avoid immediate tactical threats and assess the developing board, seeking to redeploy to a more active square and support potential pawn advances or offer defensive coverage. Solidifying white's central presence and providing a vital escape square for the king, this maneuver anticipates potential threats and creates breathing room. Sacrificing temporary pawn stability for a more active king position, seeking centralization and potential counterplay against white's less mobile pieces. Shifting the queen to the third rank opens up the d-file for potential infiltration, while also subtly preparing to redeploy the knight to a more active square later. Recentralizing the knight to c6 unlocks potential for pressure on white's queenside and prepares for further piece development, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed white king. Shifting that knight to the queenside opens up the file for potential pressure and prepares to challenge black's control of the central squares, aiming to untangle white's pieces from their current somewhat passive setup. Shifting the queen towards the kingside aims to create attacking potential, perhaps by rerouting it to a more active square like g5 or h5, thereby increasing pressure on white's underdeveloped kingside and indirectly challenging white's control of the central files. Reorganizing the queen's placement opens up the e-file for the rook and aims to create a more flexible defensive structure, perhaps anticipating a pawn push on the kingside later or preparing to shift attacking pressure. Initiating a fascinating strategic repositioning, black redirects the queen to a more active square, aiming to coordinate it with the knight and prepare for potential advances on the kingside. Probing the kingside with the knight, aiming to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially create weaknesses. Grasping the diagonal thrust across the board, black's bishop now anchors itself to a crucial square, bolstering the central pawn structure and preparing to contest the open lines that white has so diligently carved out. Unlocking the c-file by capturing the knight immediately forces a significant pawn structure change, potentially simplifying the position, but also creating a passed pawn for black on the d-file should white not be careful. Capturing the knight opens a crucial diagonal for your queen, aiming directly at white's king and creating immediate attacking potential, while also solidifying your pawn structure by removing a dangerous piece that was eyeing your queenside. A cunning maneuver, this *qg5* attempts to exploit the exposed queenside pawns and the slightly out-of-play dark-squared bishop. White aims to create immediate threats against the king by potentially opening lines, while also preparing to seize control of key diagonals or files. Notice how the queen's repositioning directly challenges black's ability to comfortably coordinate their pieces, forcing a careful defense. This isn't just about attacking, it's about disrupting black's setup and forcing them into a reactive posture. Shifting the rook to the h-file immediately presents a tactical conundrum for white, seeking to exploit the loose bishop on g5 and potentially activate the king's defense. Unlocking a kingside assault begins by forcing the opponent's queen from its secure central post.